In the aftermath of Japan's surrender in 1945, the nation found itself faced with a staggering surplus of military materials, weapons, and equipment. Among these, the stockpiled aircraft engines stood out, not merely as remnants of a once formidable military industry but as an emblem of the war's destructive legacy. After years of conflict, Japan's aviation industry had produced thousands of aircraft engines for fighter planes, bombers, and transport aircraft. These engines, which had powered Japan's formidable air force during the war, now sat idle, remnants of a lost war effort. Yet, in the immediate post-war period, their fate was far from certain. The vast quantities of engines, many in advanced stages of production or already stockpiled in warehouses, represented a logistical and economic dilemma that would unfold in unexpected ways. By the end of the war, Japan had built an industrial infrastructure capable of mass-producing aircraft engines at an impressive scale. The quantity of stockpiled engines, scattered across various factories, storage facilities, and military bases, was enormous. Estimates suggest that by the summer of 1945, Japan's aviation industry had produced over 40,000 aircraft engines for military use. These ranged from the widely used Najima Ha-45 and Mitsubishi Kinsei engines to more specialized models like the radial engines for the Najima Ki 84 Frank and the liquid-cooled engines for the Kawasaki Ki 61 Tony. The sheer scale of these inventories posed an immediate question for the new post-war Japanese government, which was under the occupation of the Allied forces, led by the United States. The initial months after Japan's surrender were marked by uncertainty and a sense of stillness. The nation's factories, which had once operated at full capacity to support the war effort, now faced a dramatic halt. With the end of hostilities, the demand for military equipment, particularly aircraft engines, plummeted. Japan's aviation industry had been thoroughly decimated, and its primary role in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy evaporated overnight. The question of what to do with these surplus engines was not just a logistical challenge but also a reflection of the broader economic pressures that Japan would face in the coming years. In the face of food shortages, a devastated economy, and the need for rebuilding, the decision to keep or dispose of vast stores of aircraft engines became one of many difficult choices. The presence of such a large surplus of aircraft engines was also tied to Japan's broader post-war economic restructuring. The country's industrial capacity had been severely limited by Allied policies, particularly the insistence on demilitarization. While the production of military goods was halted, the need for raw materials and industrial labor remained. The Japanese economy, reliant on an industry now repurposed for civilian use, faced the issue of unused assets that were of no immediate value to the peace economy. The engines, designed for a war that had ended, were effectively obsolete. Repurposing them for civilian purposes was not a viable solution, given the specialized nature of these engines, which were designed for military aircraft rather than commercial applications. The U.S. occupation authorities had their own pressing concerns. The American goal was to dismantle Japan's military-industrial complex to prevent any future military resurgence. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers, a policy of disarmament and demilitarization was pursued. This included dismantling factories, seizing military assets, and overseeing the destruction of weapons and munitions. The Japanese aircraft engines, stored in large quantities across the country, were subject to the same treatment. Their surplus status marked them as prime candidates for disposal, though the logistics of this process were complicated by the fact that the engines were often scattered across remote sites, many of which were in disrepair due to the destruction wrought by the war. In the immediate post-war years, the United States focused on disarming Japan and ensuring that its remaining war assets were either destroyed or repurposed. The engines, many of which were stored in wartime facilities or hidden in warehouses, were sometimes taken for analysis by the American forces, who sought to understand the technological advances behind Japan's aviation industry. These engines, often still in usable condition, represented valuable engineering knowledge, and there were some early efforts to preserve and study them for their technological insights. However, the sheer volume of engines made such efforts cumbersome. Instead, the engines were increasingly regarded as an impediment to the economic recovery and political stability of post-war Japan. One early post-war decision involved the dismantling of aircraft production plants. Many of the factories that had produced aircraft engines were quickly retooled for civilian purposes, or they were dismantled entirely. A significant portion of these engines, which were still in their original crates, were either sold off for scrap metal or left to deteriorate in the harsh post-war environment. The resources used to manufacture these engines, steel, aluminum, and rare alloys, were precious commodities in the devastated economy. The decision to scrap thousands of engines, however, was not taken lightly. The cost of dismantling and transporting these engines was high, and there was often little incentive to do so unless immediate economic pressures demanded it. As the years wore on, many of these engines began to slowly deteriorate in storage, particularly in regions where wartime damage had compromised the infrastructure. The Japanese government, under the constraints of Allied oversight, struggled to find an efficient way to deal with the engines. By 1947, it was clear that Japan's war assets, including the stockpiled aircraft engines, would not be used for military purposes in the foreseeable future. With an emphasis on rebuilding the civilian economy, these engines were seen less as a potential resource and more as a logistical burden. As the Cold War began to take shape, Japan's future was increasingly aligned with the United States and the broader Western powers. The engines, in the end, became one of the many vestiges of the past that Japan would be forced to abandon. Their fate, largely forgotten by the historical record, mirrors the broader economic struggles of a nation in transition, one that had to reconcile its past military power with the demands of post-war peace and reconstruction. As the 1950s dawned, the stockpiles of engines began to diminish, but not without consequences. The engines that were scrapped or abandoned did not just represent wasted resources, they symbolized a profound historical loss. The industrial expertise that went into creating these engines, along with the thousands of labor hours spent producing them, was wiped out in the name of demilitarization. The engines themselves, too, became a casualty of the larger geopolitical reshuffling, swept away by the demands of rebuilding a shattered nation. Yet the full story of their disposal and the economic and political pressures surrounding them would take years to fully unfold. The post-war fate of Japan's stockpiled aircraft engines evolved as the nation navigated the complex process of rebuilding. While the first years of occupation were dominated by immediate reconstruction efforts, the years following the formal end of military demobilization in 1952 would reveal the long-term consequences of the decisions made in the immediate aftermath of World War II. By this time, Japan had begun to turn its focus to its role within the global economy and the remnants of its wartime military-industrial complex, including the thousands of unused aircraft engines, would gradually fade into obscurity. But before they did, the processes of disposal, repurposing, and economic pressure would shape the future of Japan's aviation industry. One of the key challenges for post-war Japan was the systemic dismantling of its war machinery, including the vast industrial network that had supported its military during the conflict. With the onset of the Korean War in 1950, however, Japan's situation began to shift. The United States, having secured Japan as an ally in the emerging Cold War, recognized the need to revitalize the nation's economy. The stockpiled aircraft engines, though remnants of Japan's militaristic past, could not be entirely disregarded in the face of this new reality. While the focus was on rebuilding Japan's civilian industries, the United States had a vested interest in Japan's industrial capacity, both for economic reasons and for strategic military positioning in the Pacific. Thus, some of the aircraft engines would find a new purpose. The Korean War, which began in 1950, offered Japan a window of opportunity for industrial revival. The United States, which was heavily involved in the conflict, needed materials, supplies, and components to support its military operations. While Japan's aviation industry was still constrained by the pacifist constitution, it was recognized as a key supplier for the broader war effort. The sudden shift in economic priorities also meant that Japan's war assets, including its surplus engines, could be repurposed to meet the demands of the American military. Despite these opportunities, the quantity of stockpiled aircraft engines remained overwhelming. Hundreds of thousands of engines, some of which had been stored for nearly half a decade, were still sitting idle. The industrial machinery required to break down and repurpose these engines, which had been designed to power military aircraft, was not easily adapted to civilian needs. Many of these engines were large, highly specialized radial and inline engines with military applications that were difficult to convert for civilian use, such as for commercial airliners or transport aircraft. Thus, the majority of them were still considered surplus, even as the Japanese economy began to grow. One significant measure taken by the Japanese government was the sale of large quantities of these engines as scrap metal. Some engines, still in relatively good condition, were sold off to various industries for repurposing as raw material, though the vast majority were simply broken down for their metals. Aluminum, copper, and steel, all in high demand for rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, were extracted from the engines and used in the construction of everything from residential housing to bridges. While this contributed to Japan's economic recovery, it also meant that these engines, products of sophisticated military engineering, were effectively lost to history. Simultaneously, there was growing interest in preserving Japan's military technological heritage, but this was driven more by external forces than by any internal desire to reflect on the nation's wartime history. In the United States, military engineers and intelligence agencies showed interest in acquiring and analyzing Japan's aircraft engines for their technological value. They sought to reverse engineer the designs, hoping to understand the engineering principles behind Japan's wartime aviation advancements. Some engines, such as the Mitsubishi Ha-112-2 radial engine, were shipped to American facilities for analysis, where engineers hoped to draw lessons that could be applied to U.S. military technology. However, these efforts were far from systematic, and only a small percentage of engines were preserved for technical study. Most, by far, were destroyed or melted down for materials. The 1950s also marked a shift in Japan's industrial priorities. The focus on heavy industry and military production gave way to the development of civilian infrastructure, consumer goods, and technology. As Japan became increasingly integrated into the global economy, its manufacturing capabilities were directed toward the production of automobiles, consumer electronics, and, later, advanced industrial machinery. The aviation industry, which had once been a pillar of Japan's military might, was largely left behind in favor of these new priorities. Aircraft engines, particularly the surplus from the war, were now seen as a reminder of a lost era, a symbol of Japan's militaristic past that had little place in the country's new industrial reality. By the mid-1950s, the majority of Japan's stockpiled aircraft engines had been either scrapped, sold off, or abandoned in poorly maintained storage facilities. Only a few engines, often of notable technical value, were retained for preservation in museums or by collectors. These were the exceptions, not the rule. As the country continued its post-war recovery, its focus shifted toward rebuilding its infrastructure and economy from the ground up, without the burden of the military-industrial complex that had once fueled its war effort. In retrospect, the scale of the loss of these engines is striking. Thousands of engines, most of them advanced, highly specialized pieces of military technology, were discarded in favor of scrap metal, repurposed as raw materials for civilian industry, or forgotten in the face of economic necessity. The decision to dismantle, destroy, or repurpose these engines was not born out of malice but out of a pragmatic necessity in a time of overwhelming need. The young post-war government, under the constraints of occupation and the need to rebuild from almost complete devastation, had few other options. The country's focus was on survival, not on preserving the technological legacy of its military past. Moreover, Japan's post-war aviation industry was slow to revive. The Japanese government's constraints, coupled with the pacifist constitution that restricted the military use of Japan's military forces, kept the country from developing its own military aircraft for many years. While the country did eventually re-enter the aviation field, it was through civilian aircraft development rather than military aircraft production. The stockpiled engines, once intended for high-performance aircraft like the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden and the Najima Ki-84, were no longer relevant to Japan's new role in the international order. The economic pressures on the Japanese government to discard or scrap these engines were overwhelming, and by the late 1950s, Japan had largely put the war behind it. The engines, which had once been symbols of technological might and industrial achievement, had been reduced to scrap, or worse, abandoned in forgotten warehouses. The legacy of Japan's wartime aviation industry would not be found in these engines, but in the broader transformation of the country from a war-torn nation to a global industrial powerhouse. The fate of Japan's stockpiled aircraft engines was, in many ways, a reflection of the broader trends that marked the post-war period. Just as Japan's military was dismantled and repurposed for peaceful purposes, so too were the remnants of its military-industrial complex, including its aircraft engines, discarded or forgotten. The engines were not the only wartime assets to be treated in this way. They were simply one of many examples of how the material culture of war was gradually erased in the process of rebuilding a nation. What remained were the traces of a past that could not be fully reconciled but had to be moved beyond. As Japan moved into the late 20th century, the remnants of its wartime past, including the aircraft engines, would be little more than footnotes in the larger story of its remarkable post-war recovery.